So we're going to be talking about the Hasidic community, and I don't want to get too much into details about the formation and the Baal Shem Tov and the philosophies, but I think I should do just a little bit of an intro that on a high level, and then we'll move on to the story that we're going to be covering tonight. So the Hasidic movement really begins with the Baal Shem Tov, a name I'm sure we're all familiar with. He's born in 1700, he dies in 1760, and there's always a debate between who the Baal Shem Tov was. Was he, an outcast? Was he a weirdo that mainstream rabbis didn't like? But he still gathered around a community of students and colleagues that liked his message, or was he really a an accepted rabbi in the community that he lived in? And I'm just going to share my screen here so we could just look at something now. So bear with me. So the question may have been solved a couple of decades ago, and somebody, a researcher by the name of Moshe Rossman, he found records, which are the tax census records from the 1740s in the town of Mezhbizh, where the Baal Shem Tov lived and where he's buried. And we can see here that his name is listed, not his name, Yisrael ben Eliezer, but it just says Balzam, which is Baal Shem. And he doesn't pay any taxes because he's living in a community provided house. So according to this researcher and many others, this kind of shifts the idea of the Baal Shem Tov away from being an outsider to kind of prove that in Mezhbizh, which wasn't a small shtetl, it was a large town. It was a center of commerce. The equivalent of the I-95 passed through. So if you were traveling from Kyiv, all the way to the other side of the country, you're going to pass through Mezhbizh. You can see here that it's close to Kiev or Kyiv. So we don't think that the Baal Shem Tov was really an outsider. So who was the Baal Shem Tov? Baal Shem Tov means master of the good name. And what that essentially means is he's a shaman of sorts. He's a specialist in what people would call practical Kabbalah, or he's a magician. He writes amulets. He can perform exorcisms. He can heal the sick. He can do other miraculous things. This may sound familiar to one of the characters we spoke about in the last session, Jonathan Eybeschutz. And Jonathan Eybeschutz also, a lot of the scandal around him had to do with the fact that he wrote amulets. So Jonathan Eybeschutz, I didn't refer to him this way last time, but he was also a Baal Shem Tov of sorts. He was also a normative rabbi in his community. So that's a model to show that the Baal Shem Tov also, he can be a shaman and also can still be like an accepted, respected element of the, the rabbinical heads of the communities he lived in. So the Baal Shem Tov, here we can see his grave in Mezhbizh, in the shul that they say that he davened in during his lifetime. So he gathered around him a circle of students. There were many students. Here's a couple of them. We'll just look at their names. You have Dovid, the Maggid of Mezrich, who we're going to talk about again. He's considered the main student of the Baal Shem Tov. And after the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760, the Maggid of Mezrich becomes, formally the leader of this movement that we'll analyze a little bit further later. We have Baruch of Mezhbizh, which is the Baal Shem Tov's grandson, who also becomes a Hasidic leader in the first, second and third generations. We have Mordechai Twersky of Chernobyl. People may be familiar with the name Twersky. There's a lot of Rabbi Twerskys today, like the professor Abraham J. Twersky. This is his ancestor. We have Schneider Zalman of Liadi, who is the founding rabbi of the Lubavitch Hasidic family. Aryeh, Leib, the Shpolia Zeida, and Meragadol of Premishilan. And these are just a few names, and of course, there are many more. So as we said, the Baal Shem Tov died in 1760, and the Maggid of Mezrich becomes the leader of this Hasidic movement. Now, it's hard to call it a Hasidic movement. Nobody really thinks that the Baal Shem Tov really believed he created a movement. He more had a philosophy that we can call Hasidut, Hasidism, and it was really only later in in the 1770s that there started to become a self-awareness amongst the Baal Shem Tov students and the students of the Maggid of Mezrich that they were really now a separate group of people. And this really fits in line with the fact that the rabbinate of Vilna, including the Gaon of Vilna, who issued their chayrim, their excommunication against Hasidim, it didn't really happen until the late 1770s. That's already that's 17 years after the Baal Shem Tov died, and it's a couple of years after the Maggid Mezrich died. So we're already in the second, third generation of Hasidim before there's even the excommunication against them, because that is really when the idea that they were a separatist group started to become obvious. Now, some of the problems that the rabbinate in Vilna had with Hasidim, were listed in these chayrim. So, for example, they accused them of neglecting Talmud study, and they preferred to study the Kabbalah texts, or they didn't wear tefillin on the in-between days of Sukkot and Pesach. They created their separatist shuls. They stopped davening with the same siddur that everybody in Europe was using, Nusach Ashkenaz, and they switched to Nusach Sfard. And then there were other things also where the Mitnagdim, the people who oppose him, didn't like the concept of the Admar, the concept of the Rebbe, who collected money and gave out blessings. They thought that they were turning the rabbinate into like a commercial venture. There's now a commercial relationship between, rabbi and, the lay people. So in addition to the challenges coming from the outside, within the Hasidic community, there was also debates amongst themselves at this point about what is this movement? What do we stand for? And the debate could really be boiled down to two different concepts. Was the message of the Baal Shem Tov supposed to be a down-to-earth way of living, or was it supposed to be a lofty way of living? Now, what is the difference? Down to earth means simple faith, focusing on ethical self-perfection, finding holiness in everyday things, uplifting the material world, and not distancing ourselves from the material world, but using material things to live a holy life. That's the down-to-earth possibility. The other was lofty, which is more of a Kabbalistic movement where we have goals of drawing close to God, and materialism can really be a barrier between the goal of connecting ourselves to God. So let me just stop sharing for a moment. So so that's really the debate within the Hasidic community themselves, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later as well. So as I said, the Maggid of Mezrich, the Baal Shem Tov dies in 1760, the Maggid of Mezrich dies in the 1770s, and at that point, the leadership of the Hasidic community more or less now goes back to the family of the Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov's grandson, Baruch of Mezrich, and Baruch of Mezrich, and he is on the side of the Hasidic movement should be down to earth, and he also is a shaman like his grandfather. He gives out amulets. He can do exorcisms. He can pray to heal people from different ailments. And he also starts to model a new type of community where there's a court, where he has a community where people come to visit him. He has large palaces that he lives in. There's a court jester who can entertain people. There's kitchens to serve meals, all day for all the people coming and going to visit this rabbi. And he starts as well the concept now that you can't be a Hasidic leader as a self-upstart. You really need to be from the family of a previous Hasidic leader. So he thinks anyone else who's a Hasidic leader are usurpers. They don't really have a right to lead Hasidic communities. He wants to be the central leader. All right, so that's the Baal Shem Tov's grandson. Now, around this time, while Baruch was the leader of the Hasidic movement, his nephew is born, and that nephew's name is Nachman, who later would become known as Nachman of Breslov. I'm sure we've all heard of Nachman of Breslov. And he's born into his uncle's court, and he sees the regal way that he lives and the way that he collects money from followers in exchange for blessings. And he also sees the lifestyle of the Hasidim in the court, where they're very simple, they're materialistic, and he's very turned off by this representation of what he thinks his great-grandfather's message was. He's more in tune with the lofty version of Hasidism, and he doesn't really want to have anything to do with it. However, in 1798 or 1799, he actually makes a trip to Israel, and he spends a while there, and he comes back in 1800, and whatever happened on that trip, he decides now it's time to enter the family business. So I'm just going to share my screen again. So Nachman of Breslov, you see here, I put a little tree where you can see that he's the nephew of Baruch. He's a great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. And what does Nachman of Breslov do when he comes back from Israel in 1800? He moves into a town called Zlatopol. Now, Zlatopol was already under the Megiddos, meaning it was under the authority of another Hasidic rabbi, a name we saw before called the Shpolia Zeida. Shpolia was a community about 2 miles away from Zlatopol, and the Shpolia Zeida having authority over Zlatopol, it means that he has an agreement with the community that he provides leadership, he provides arbitration for disputes, he can provide a local rabbi, he can provide the chazan for the shul, the shochet for kosher meat, and he really controls the religious life of the community. However, Nachman moves in 1800 before Rosh Hashanah, and by Yom Kippur, he's already built up a little bit of a following from the locals who actually like him more. They either like his message or they are taken in by the fact that he's a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov that they, of course, revere. And by Yom Kippur, Nachman and his followers are able to completely take over the central shul in Zlatopol. They eject the rabbi, they eject the chazan, they eject the gabbai, they take it over and they install their own people. So this was a very big provocation. It wasn't just him doing what he did. He was really challenging the Shpolia Zeida's down-to-earth style of Hasidus. He was really challenging his uncle's style of Hasidus because he was going to come into a territory that's already controlled and try and change the style of the Hasidim living there. So the Shpolia Zeida, of course, didn't take this lightly. And 2 weeks later, after Sukkot, he arrives in Zlatopol and he denounces Nachman of Breslov. Well, he's not called Nachman of Breslov yet, but he's called Nachman Hordenker. That's his family last name. He denounces him and accuses him of having no original ideas. Where does he think Nachman gets his ideas from? He says that he actually has a notebook of his grandfather's notes and ideas, not his grandfather from his mother's family, not the Baal Shem Tov's family, his paternal grandfather, whose name was Nachman Hordenker, also same name that he has. And he just says that he's just stealing his grandfather's ideas and presenting them as his own. He's not really an original thinker. He's not really a tzaddik. He's not worthy of being followed. Nachman, on the other hand, responded, calling the Shpolia Zeida a fake tzaddik, and he also referred to him. His name was Aryeh Leib. He referred to him as Leib Shamish. Leib Shamish meaning Leib the Gabbai. Now, Gabbai is a very it's an important job and it's a privileged job. But if you're the leader of, if you're a Hasidic leader of an entire town, it could be an insult to refer to you as, the Gabbai of the shul. Now, Nachman as well also started to refer to himself as the one true tzaddik of the generation. So he has very grand ideas of who he is and where he fits into Jewish history. And he also refers to the Shpolia Zeida as being a messenger of Satan. He writes that the Satan, Satan, he can't be everywhere at once to destroy the world. So he sends out messengers to help accomplish his goals, and the Shpolia Zeida was one of his messengers. So in response, the Shpolia Zeida tries to organize a cherem against Nachman of Breslov, and then Nachman of Breslov tries to organize a cherem against the Shpolia Zeida. When they both have mild success, and it's not clear whether they accomplished that cherem goal. It doesn't seem that either of them did. So we have here the first dispute between Breslov and the rest of the Hasidic community, where the likely explanation of this dispute is the Shpolia Zeida either is being territorial, he already has control over a community, and he's afraid that a great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov will really, move people away from him to Nachman himself. And he also may have legitimately felt that Nachman's message of an intense Kabbalistic Chassidus is not something that the average person really will respond well to. He really believes that Baal Shem Tov's message was meant to be more down to earth and to really uplift the average person. So it could have been philosophical, it could have been territorial, but either way, we now have the first stage of battles between Breslov and the Hasidic community. Now, in 1802, Nachman finally gives up. He moves out of Zlatopol. He moves to Breslov, the town that he becomes famous for. And he writes that his 2 years in Zlatopol were worse than hell. Why? Because he was in Zlatopol for 24 months, and in Jewish tradition, hell doesn't last longer than 12 months. So he was in hell longer than the Jewish hell lasts for. So in Breslov, Nachman continues to build up this concept around who he is. He even implies that he might be the Messiah. He also implies that he's actually greater than his own great-grandfather, the Baal Shem Tov. And he eventually dies young in 1811 from tuberculosis. And the Shpolia Zeida, who survives it, was much older than him, but survives him, issued decrees that nobody should visit his grave, nobody should read his works. And so the general feeling of negativity towards Nachman also now exists towards his followers, even after he's gone. And famously, people used to refer to Breslover Hassidim as Toite Hassidim, dead Hassidim. They're following a dead Rebbe. And famously, the Breslover Hassidim would respond back, better a dead Rebbe with living Hasidim than a living Rebbe with dead Hasidim, meaning everyone's insulting each other back and forth. So, okay, now we have the first debates between these two Rebbes, and I want to talk a little bit about what is a Rebbe exactly. So it's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read it all, but these are excerpts from Hasidic literature from the mid-1800s. So we're talking about a little under 100 years after the Baal Shem Tov dies, and a lot of the different concepts of what is the theory of the tzaddik, what is a Rebbe, has been crystallized and is being put into writing now. So I'm just going to quickly read a couple of ideas that the Rebbes were saying about themselves and what the Hasidim, were hearing and obviously believing. So in section 1, it says, Ve'od yesh lahem derech avoda shel es ata kodem bias HaMashiach, that the Rebbes, the Admars, the rabbis, they have a service in the world that nowadays, before the Messiah comes, yivatlu kol adinim Yisrael, they can actually single-handedly cancel out, evil decrees against the Jews. Okay, in number 2, it says another excerpt that says, "Ki kamosha neshama manigas aguf," just like the soul leads the physical body, and it gives life to the body. So too the tzaddikim, they give life and keep the existence of the entire generation going. In number 3, they start to get even a little bit more specific about the relationship to the Admar, to the Rebbe. It says, "Kol hamahar achrei Rabbo," anyone who has negative, cynical ideas about their rabbi, ki'ilu mahar achar shchina. It's as if you have doubts and you're being cynical of God's presence itself. Okay, in number 4, we say, Ki be'emes bilti es kashrus l'tzadikim. The truth is, without connecting yourselves to the tzaddik, yochlem chas v'shalom lipol l'redes shachas, you can fall into dark pits of questions, and you won't really understand God and the world. Okay, in number 5, it starts to get even more specific. It says, Ki al yedei shemahana hatalmidei chachamim menechasav, that through helping the rabbis with your money, the nosnim tzedakah, and giving them charity, al yedei zeh medabek atzmai b'havaya baruch, that's a way for you to connect yourself to God. Meaning the rabbi, he's connected to God. And how do you connect yourself to God? By supporting the rabbi in his mission. And then in number 7, we have another statement about the Admar. And Admar and Rebbe are like all interchangeable words. It says, "V'gam b'sichas chulin shel Talmidei Chachamim," even in the idle chatter of a Hasidic rabbi, tzarich lahamin sheyesh ben razin tamarin. We have to believe that there are deep, very deep and meaningful secrets. When an Admar speaks, it may sound like he's just chit-chatting, but there's really very deep, Kabbalistic or very deep secrets that he's really thinking about. And then he goes on to say in this particular text that this is something that this is a belief that we have from Har Sinai, all the way back to Sinai. And then finally in number 8, we say, Kia Iker, his kashrus betzadikim, the main way to connect ourselves to the rabbi, hu kashamaksa kideim umas bekol tzarcheim, when we support them financially. So at this point, we have an understanding now of where the tzaddik, what a tzaddik is, what a Hasidic rabbi is, how they fit into the vision of the movement, and how the followers viewed them. These were extremely holy people. They had special abilities, and if you were connected to one, you were able to tap into their powers in a sense. You would benefit from it personally. So this is why when there's a fight between the Shpolia Zeida and Nachman of Breslov, why the battle was so fierce. Now, as I said, Nachman dies in 1911, the Shpolia Zeida dies a year later, and the first round of fighting with Breslov comes to an end. Now, over the next few decades, the Hasidic movement really grows and expands, and there's tons of new, generations of Rebbes that are now popping up all over Europe. And at this point, we're in the 1830s, and the leading Admar in, what we look at today as Ukraine, was a rabbi by the name of Moshe Tzvi of Savran, and he's a student of Nachman of Breslov's uncle, Baruch, and he's also a student of the Shpolia Zeida. So what does that mean? It means he's opposed to Breslov's lofty version. He really is a proponent of the down-to-earth version of Chassidus. And in 1835, he actually issues a total excommunication against Breslover Hassidim. And I'm going to tell you what the excommunication says first, and then we'll talk about reasons why it happened afterwards. So I want to save time, so I'll just translate. So what he says here is that I'm announcing throughout all of the land that the Breslover Hasidus has arisen. They sin and they cause other people to sin, and therefore I'm warning anyone who listens to my voice to distance these evil people as much as possible. Don't marry into their families because it's forbidden for them to enter the nation of God. Don't hire a Breslover to teach your children Torah because your children will turn into heretics. Don't hire a shochet to prepare your meat because their food is not the food won't be kosher. Don't allow them to be a chazan in your shul because their prayers are an abomination. And he goes on to say, anyone who has pity on a Breslover, you can't have pity on that person. And anyone who listens to my voice, God should send them a blessing in all that they do, and they'll have a place in the world to come. So we have here in the mid-1830s a cherem that goes out against Breslovers, and on the bottom we see the grave of Moshe Savran, the person who issued this, and on the right we have the grave of Nosson of Rimanov. Nosson of Rimanov was the primary student of Nachman of Breslov. Nachman doesn't have any heirs to take over the community, so his student is now the leader of the Breslov community. So what came from this cherem? So we know from memoir literature and from other sources that it was endless harassment of Breslover Hassidim. There are stories of rock throwing and altercations and destruction of Breslover synagogues, and that the books that were being produced on the Nachman of Breslov's teachings were being placed in the bathroom outhouses in different communities. They were really being defiled. And in Uman, where Nachman of Breslov was buried, if people came on Rosh Hashanah to visit his grave, nobody would rent a room to them. Inns wouldn't invite them in, so they would have to sleep on benches in the shul, or they'd have to sleep on the street. And in addition to that, Nachman of Breslov, the student of Nosson of Breslov, the student of Nachman of Breslov, who was the leader, who was busy publishing a lot of the works of Nachman of Breslov, called Lakutei Maharan. You can see it's an extensive library of writings there in the middle. He was busy printing all of these books. Without a license. His printing house didn't have a license. He wasn't getting the censorship approval that he was required. And so he was turned into the Russian authorities. They shut down the printing press. They destroyed whatever books they can get a hold of. And he was exiled from Breslov. And he couldn't return until 6 years later, like in the middle of the 1840s. Now, eventually, Moshe Savran moves into Uman. He moves into basically the center of the Breslov community. That's where Nachman is buried. And according to Breslov texts, his efforts were so successful that at this stage, you could not get a minyan in a Breslov shul anywhere. There were still people who were interested in following Nachman of Breslov and his teachings, but they were, essentially hiding. They wouldn't come out and acknowledge the fact that they, were followers of his philosophies. Now, what's the cause of this second stage of battles with Breslov and now Moshe Savran? So it could be Moshe Savran is a student of the Shpolia Zeida. He decides to pick up the mantle of his teacher and continue the fight that his teacher began. several decades later, everybody thought Breslov would disappear with the death of Nachman, and it clearly hadn't. So he now is trying to, finish the job, so to speak. There could also be a possibility that he was jealous of the perception that Breslovers were more of a spiritual community, and his community was more simple and materialistic, and he didn't like the fact that those two communities were seen as being, one opposed to the other. And then also it could have been that, he didn't like the idea that people were following, again, a Rebbe who was dead. It wasn't a concept that people agreed with. Before we read through a couple of texts, explaining the theory of the tzaddik, we were showing how important a living tzaddik is in Hasidic thought. So if you're following a Rebbe who's not alive, are you really Hasidic? Are you really a member of the community? And therefore, for one of these reasons, possibly Moshe Tzvi puts them into Cherem. Now, there's another theory that a fellow by the name of Tzvi Marks, a scholar on Breslov, he put forward a couple of decades ago, and it's even more of a petty explanation for what was behind this. He says that Moshe Tzvi of Savran and Nosson, Nachman's student, were actually childhood friends. However, in 1827, Nachman had already died, but his daughter was available for marriage. And Moshe Tzvi, who was in his 40s at the time, proposed himself as a match to marry Nachman's daughter. And Nosson rejected this idea. Why? Well, it could either be because Moshe Tzvi, who was a major leading Hasidic figure at the time, would really, if he married Nachman's daughter, he would take over the Breslov community, and there would be no space for Nosson anymore in a leadership role. Or it could have also been that he knew that Moshe Tzvi opposed the philosophy of Nachman, and by him taking over Breslov, he would really soften or do away with, Nachman's philosophy. So, he would really just destroy the Breslov community. So, in response, a couple of years later, to get revenge, Moshe Tzvi of Savran just decides to put everybody in Breslov into Cherem, destroys the community. And what does he do next? He actually moved to Uman. He was in Savran. He's a leading Rebbe of the time, and he picks up his cord and he moves to Uman, which kind of put the nail in the casket, so to speak. So no, that's another possible explanation. Now, why was it important for Moshe Tzvi of Savran to marry Nachman's granddaughter? People don't like, his rabbi was opposed to Nachman. People don't like Nachman of Breslov. They don't like Breslovers. So why exactly is he wanting to marry the granddaughter? So there's a concept that, if you're in the family of the Baal Shem Tov, you are in a prime position in the Hasidic community. You are part of the royal family, so to speak, of Hasidic rabbis. And just to explain, that this really was an actual concept, here I'm showing some text. It's a story that I found somewhere where it says that a certain rabbi who was born in 1812, his name is Yitzchak Twersky of Skver. He's an ancestor of the current rabbi of New Square who lives in upstate New York. So he actually married a great-great-granddaughter of the Baal Shem Tov. It was his third marriage. And according to the story, he said the following: Ein kavanasi l'tovas hasmi. I'm not marrying the great-granddaughter of the Baal Shem Tov for my own benefit. El kol chavtzi v'ritzayni lahamshech imeno dar is Baal Shem Kerzenikov. Why am I marrying the great-grandchild of the Baal Shem Tov? I know she's a nice person, but that's not why. I'm marrying her because I want to be able to produce through her descendants of the Baal Shem Tov. And he married her, and their great-grandson is the current Square Rebbe, the Admiral of Square, upstate in Monsey, New York. You could see here he's about a sixth generation descendant of the Baal Shem Tov. And he's standing there at the podium in this photo. He's wearing a special fur coat that Hasidic leaders wear. He's surrounded by his sons, who are also, and one of his brother-in-laws, who are also wearing these special coats. So, they're part of the Baal Shem Tov's family. That gives them a special position in the Hasidic mind. So Moshe Savran wanted this for himself, and he was unsuccessful. נחman, stopped him. So he takes revenge on Breslov. All right, so Moshe Tzvi dies. Now we're going to move on a couple of decades later. Moshe Tzvi dies in 1837. נחman, the student of Nachman of Breslov, dies in 1844. And we cut to now the 1860s, and there's an entirely new generation of Hasidic leadership in Ukraine, and it's mostly controlled by the Twersky family. There's 8 siblings and 8 brothers. They're all Hasidic rabbis spread all over the Ukraine. And the primary, the most successful of the brothers was a fellow by the name of Dovid Twersky of Tolna, the Tolner Rebbe. He moves to Tolna in 1852. He was invited by Count Peter Shulavov, who was the count, the owner of this town, and it's in his interest to invite a leading Hasidic master to come live in his town because it's going to increase tax revenue. There'll be thousands of visitors a year. There'll be lots of business, new inns, restaurants, taverns, and he's going to make a lot of money. So he's happy to have, this rabbi move into his community. So what we find now is that in the 1860s, there's a new uptick in fights with Breslov Hassidim, mostly coming from the followers of Dovid of Tolna, the Tolner Rebbe. So I'm once again going to show you a picture. So we actually have a drawing of what Dovid of Tolna looked like. And there's the Count of Tolna's castle in the town of Tolna. And you can see Tolna is 25 miles from Uman, again, where Nachman of Breslov is buried. So we have an actual news report from 1863 in a Jewish Russian newspaper at the time, where it recounts what was going on in Uman. And again, we're limited for time, so I'm just going to translate instead of reading the text. But it basically says, and this is eyewitness account in a newspaper, that Breslover Hassidim in Uman were surrounded by groups of youth, all of them Jews, and they were throwing rocks and dirt at the Breslovers and calling them Breslover dogs. And the Breslovers, seeing that they're being chased, ran into their synagogue to try to find some sanctuary. And he writes here, Gam al mizbeach hazeh yigiach ha'oev b'zror netuyu b'maragadol. But even in the shul, they weren't safe. The enemy basically broke through the doors. It says, Chalone abayis yishval sasim. They broke all the windows of the synagogue to pieces. They smashed the furniture. Rocks were thrown at people, knocking them out, and they collapsed. And in addition to that, they even destroyed the Aron. The doors of the Aron were smashed with stones. And this is just like an interesting time capsule. I enjoyed reading these last 3 lines, where the writer says, very, bothered, Mazos, what is this? Ana anochi omed, where are we? Ma shem ha'adama asher anochi omed aleh. What is this land that we're standing on? Meaning, like, can you believe something like this is happening in our modern times? And he says, Uma shana ba'ira kazos, what year did this happen? And then he answers, Be'eretz Rusland ata, you're in Russia. You're Uman, and the city is the city of Uman. Shana Shnas 1863, and the year is 1863. So he can't believe in 1863, in modern times, events like this are happening. So why did this happen? Why do we think Tolner Hasidim started up this fight with Breslovers again, 60 years after the original fight with Nachman of Breslov? So in order to explain this new reason for a fight, I want to talk a drop about what the Hasidic community looked like at this time, what the rabbis were trying to support when they were seeking control over a community. So at this time, there's a couple of ways that an Admor Rebbe makes money. One of them is something called a pidyon. It's a redemption. So when a Hasid comes to visit their Rebbe, they write on a little piece of paper called a kvittel, their names and the names of their families, and a couple of requests that they want the rabbi to pray for them about. And they give the rabbi money when they do that. So that's one method of making money. Another one is called mamado taxes, that if you're a member of this rabbi's community, you really have to pay membership dues. And there were people who would travel around to all the different parts of Ukraine collecting these taxes from the followers. And then the final method was something called a magidus. What does that mean? A magid, that the rabbis were given something really like an economic contract, where the town would give economic control to the rabbi and his family, and a monopoly over the sale of certain types of things, like salt and soap. And in exchange, the rabbi would, be the religious leader of the community. He'd provide them with local rabbis and ritual slaughterers and a chazan for the shul. He would help arbitrate, fights between different members of the community. And why did the rabbis need so much money? Because they had built up a court, really. This is an image of the court in Lubavitch in Chabad. And you could see it's a little town. They have the Great Hall, they have the smaller halls, they have lecture halls, they have stables for horses and carriages, they have the house for the rabbis, they have house for the rabbis' children. And here's on the left is a hand-drawn image of another rabbi's court I found in a biography of the daughter of an Admor, where you could see there's an inner court where the family has their houses and beautiful gardens, and there's an outer court where the Hasidim would come in and would have a shul and have a dining room. And I also have very fascinatingly an excerpt from a memoir of someone who actually was in Tolna while Dovid of Tolna was alive and running his court there. And I just want to read a little bit of it, just to give you a taste, because this will give you a better idea of what these communities were like better than I can explain it. So what it says here is, sprawling over a spacious meadow in the middle of the town of Tolna was a great court, surrounded on all sides by a fence, a little townlet of its own, containing large and marvelous magnificent buildings, like little palaces, a separate palace for the Rebbe's wife, a palace for their son, a palace for their son-in-law. Each house excelled in taste and beauty, with good utensils and costly furniture. They all had their own special men and maidservants. And of course, there was the home of the tzaddik himself, which surpassed all others in beauty and grandeur. And then he goes on to say that there were buildings that were large enough to hold 2,000 visiting Hasidim at one time. And there were bathhouses and steam rooms, and there was a mikveh, of course, and there were dairy kitchens and meat kitchens, and there were separate full-time staff cooking in both for all of the visitors that were constantly coming to visit the rabbi and ask for blessings. So that's just to give us an idea of why it was important for Dovid of Tolna to seek out and find more communities that were willing to, give him this economic contract, and also to become followers of his who will start to pay the taxes. He has a huge court to really keep up. So we actually have a example in court records and memoir literature of how Dovid of Tolna and his followers would gain control of a community. I don't know that this happened every time, but this is in the record where Dovid of Tolna was invited to a town called Kagrilik. And usually the way it worked is that the rabbi would be invited to the town to consecrate a new extension to the cemetery. And that would be considered the formal ceremony where they now become the leader of the community, and they're given this economic contract, and they leave having basically conquered a new town, so to speak. So he arrives in Kagrilik. His agents go out to ask the community leaders to give him this economic contract, and they denied it at first. And what followed was serious harassment of the community leaders. At nighttime, people, Tolner Hassidim, broke into the community leaders' houses. They allegedly took some of them hostage until they would agree to sign this contract. And a few days later, eventually the town agreed. They expelled the actual rabbi that they already had. They gave Dovid of Tolna this economic contract. He consecrated the cemetery, and in order to celebrate, they hired a military military band, and they paraded through the town with music, singing Dovid Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. David, King of Israel lives. So after they finish conquering Kagrilik, the Tolner Rebbe and his Hasidim then move on to another town called Rizishev. Now, Rizishev already had its own second generation Admor, its own second generation Rebbe. And so there's a majority of people in the town who already consider someone else to be their Hasidic leader. But there are a few Tolners there. And in order to have a reason to invite Dovid of Tolna, what they do is they buried a pig in the Jewish cemetery. They defiled it in order that it needs to be reconsecrated. And then they went and invited Dovid of Tolna to come and say, we need you to consecrate the cemetery. So he arrives, in a grand carriage with hundreds of followers. And the locals knew why he was coming. And according to court records, they greeted him by stoning his carriage. One of the stones hit him, injured him. Doesn't seem like he injured him too badly. And what happened in Kagrilik now repeated here, where his agents went around to the community leaders, asking for them to give him economic control in exchange for, providing them with religious services. And when the leaders said no, the Tolner Hasidim took over the local shul on that Shabbat, and they were fist fights, and furniture and windows were broken. And eventually what happens is Dovid of Tolna does not get the contract in this town. And he ends up leaving without the contract and without having consecrated the cemetery. So the Tolner Hasidim were obviously very embarrassed. And what they did next is pretty crazy. And again, this is in Russian court records. They forged a letter written by the existing Hasidic rabbi in Rizishev, and they sent it to the head of the Greek Orthodox Church in Kyiv, saying that he would like to convert away from Judaism to Greek Orthodoxy, and he believes that he's going to be able to convince his entire community, thousands and thousands of people, to join. And so they really suspect this might not be legitimate, and they of course visit Rizishev and they figure out that it was forged. In response, Rizishev Hasidim now take revenge on Tolner Hasidim. And what they do is they report the following fact. Dovid of Tolna, in his court in the town of Tolna, had a gold chair with, again, the words Dovid Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim written on the top. So he had a throne, and they report this to Russian authorities, who obviously take this to be, a challenge to their authority. Here's someone who's trying to be a little mini king, a little mini czar. And they open up a legal case into Dovid of Tolna, and after a couple of months of research, they conclude that he's guilty. The guilty verdict is for a few different things. One, it's that he opposes secular education, which they consider to be a crime, preventing people from studying Russian, let's say. They find him guilty of taking money from people who may not be able to afford supporting him. They find him guilty for the violence that took place in Rizichev and in the town that he was in previously. And they also confirm that this chair existed, that he had a throne with the words Dovid Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayim. And the sentence was that he was going to be exiled, somewhere really to the Far East, maybe Siberia. But the Count, Peter Shuvalov, who invited Dovid of Tolna to live there, intercedes on his behalf, and he doesn't end up getting sent into exile. What happens instead is he's condemned to house arrest, and he cannot leave the town of Russia. And this, of course, has a huge impact on his ability to grow his following and to pull in, additional money. So I have some more texts, describing these different fights, but, it's getting late, so I'm going to conclude in a couple of minutes. So here we have three separate stages of anti-Breslov fighting. We had in the 1800s, Nachman himself fighting with the Shpolia Zeida. In the 1830s, we have the Breslover Hassidim and Nosson of Breslov fighting with Moshe Savran. And then in the 1860s, we have Dovid of Tolna fighting and the Tolner Hassidim fighting with Breslov, and they each may have different reasons. The Tolner 1860s fight seems to have been about control of territory and access to money. Earlier fights may have been more, for philosophical reasons. Just to conclude, I'm going to share my screen again. So I just want to comment that I badmouthed Dovid of Tolna a lot. So I want to just point out that a lot of people, his followers, obviously, and since then, don't really perceive him to be a bad person. What you're looking at here is a picture of my own. I can connect my family to the story. You're looking at a picture of my own great-great-grandfather. His name was Aryeh Leib, and he was a rabbi in a town not far from Tolna, and he knew Dovid of Tolna personally. His name is actually memorialized in our shul. I put a picture of a memorial plaque for his daughter, and it says from a Bas Leibish. This is in the back of the shul in FHJC. And look what he writes here in the highlighted part in the book. He published this book in New York in the 1920s. He says, I heard from Dovid of Tolna that someone who enjoys anything from the pleasures of this world, even one time, they're not from the elevated people, meaning they're not a real tzaddik. And then the author goes on to say, and this I heard from him personally, from his holy mouth, that anyone who does one sin also is not a tzaddik. And then he goes on to tell a story proving that Dovid of Tolna, who again was liking to, had a gold throne, he says he never committed a sin and he never enjoyed any of the pleasures of this world at all. And that's really the perception within the Hasidic world of Dovid of Tolna. Of course, he wrote 3 books. On the bottom, you see the cover pages of those 3 books. These books were printed in his lifetime. They were reprinted multiple times in his lifetime just to show how popular they were, how popular he was. And then just to conclude, just to cut it short, what ends up happening to each of these people. So Moshe Savran, he doesn't marry a grandchild of the Baal Shem Tov, but his son does marry a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov. So his descendants are Baal Shem Tov descendants. And here you can see Abraham Joshua Heschel, who we all know was a descendant of Moshe Savran. As far as Dovid of Tolna goes, his great-grandson in 1913 was one of the first Hasidic rabbis to come to America, and he settled in the Lower East Side. And at right, you can see his townhouse, shul, 9 Attorney Street. It's at the foot of the Williamsburg Bridge. This building doesn't exist anymore. I went to check. And then very interestingly, there's a photo here of Isidore Twersky, who possibly, certainly in history, is the only person who was both a Hasidic Rebbe. He was the Tolner Rebbe of Boston. He was also professor of Hebrew, literature, and philosophy at Harvard. And he also was the son-in-law of Rabbi Soloveitchik from Yeshiva University. So you have the merging of, a descendant of the Twersky, Chernobyl, Baal Shem Tov family, marrying the daughter of the descendant of the Soloveitchik family, who are all, descendants of Chaim of Volozhin and student of the Vilna Gaons. You have like the merging of the Misnagdim and the Chassidim and the marriage of Professor Isidore Twersky. And that is the story. And as far as Breslov goes, Breslov today is probably more famous than ever. Nachman and Breslov his works are widely studied and appreciated. I don't know that they have a lot of Hasidim, like Satmar has tens of thousands of families. I don't know Breslov is at that level, but he's obviously very respected. We all are familiar with the annual pilgrimages to his grave that has, tens of thousands of people who go and visit every year. And then I just want to read one final thing and then we're done. This is from the Emanuel Ringelbaum diary from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941. And this is what it says about Breslovers living in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the prayer house of the Hassidim from Breslov, there's a large sign, Jews never despair. The Hassidim dance there with the same religious fervor that they did before the war. So Nachman's teachings obviously were very meaningful to a lot of people in his lifetime and after, and obviously to this day. And that concludes this story. And if we have time, Judy, I'm happy to take some questions unless we're out of time.